want to start off with just a couple of quick housekeeping items and notes I've been asked to share with you all. Obviously the registration line out there was a little long, so for those of you that have not registered yet, we're going to continue registration after the keynote has concluded. And so for our first session, speakers, just know that we'll have people probably trickling in while you're starting those presentations. The other thing that I was asked to note was that the Wi-Fi instructions are available in each of the breakout rooms. So for those of you still trying to connect here, there are instructions in each of those rooms. It is with great pleasure and profound gratitude that I welcome you to the 6th Annual McLean County Behavioral Health Forum. My name is Kevin McCall, and I am the Director of Behavioral Health Coordination for the McLean County government. This gathering is a testament to our shared commitment to the well-being of individuals, families, and communities, as well as our dedication to fostering understanding, compassion, and innovative solutions within the field of behavioral health. We hope that today's forum will be a place where diverse perspectives converge and the collective wisdom of experts and passionate advocates harmonizes. Together, we will embark on a journey to explore, discuss, and strategize around the critical issues that shape the landscape of behavioral health in our modern world. Behavioral health as a discipline touches lives in profound ways. It encompasses not only mental health, but also the countless behavioral patterns and choices that affect our daily lives. From managing stress and anxiety to addressing addiction, promoting emotional well-being, and ensuring access to proper care, our shared mission is to improve the quality of life for all individuals. During our time together, we will have the opportunity to engage with esteemed speakers, thought leaders, and specialists in the field. We will delve into the latest research, innovations, and best practices that drive positive change in behavioral health. Through presentations, panel discussions, and networking opportunities, we will collectively advance our understanding and pave the way for a brighter and healthier future. We also recognize that behavioral health is a deeply personal matter. Behind every statistic, every research paper, and every clinical guideline, there are individuals and families whose lives are profoundly affected. As we deliberate on policy, research, and practice, let us always keep in mind the faces and voices that represent the very heart of our cause. Throughout this forum, I encourage you to listen intently, share your insights and experiences, and ask the tough questions. Together, we can challenge the stigma surrounding behavioral health, shatter barriers to access, and create a more inclusive and empathetic society. I want to extend my deepest appreciation to all of you participants, speakers, and sponsors, and volunteers for your unwavering dedication to the field of behavioral health. Your presence here today demonstrates your commitment to making a positive impact on the lives of countless individuals. I want to specifically thank the City of Bloomington, the Town of Normal, and the McLean County government for their continued commitment to behavioral health. And I also want to thank today's many sponsors, including Carle Health, the Regional Office of Education, the McLean County Bar Association, the Mental Wellness Center, and AM Vets 270 for helping to make today a reality. I'd also like to thank our Assistant Director of Behavioral Health Coordination, Sarah Stalter, and the many community partners who contributed to making this incredible event a reality and the planning of this that took place over many months. Finally, I ask that you please take note of today's itinerary. Following our keynote presentation, you will have over 32 different breakout sessions to choose from throughout the afternoon during 4 different time slots, as well as a robust resource fair that will be going on throughout the day. At the end of today, there will be a raffle for a Fox and Hounds gift card as well, and that is for those who complete the evaluations for today's events. Those can be completed throughout the day. From a first-time concerned family member to our most seasoned clinicians, we believe there is truly something everyone will find value in today. Please come to the check-in table should you have any questions regarding any items for today's events. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Tara Powell. Dr. Powell is a researcher and advocate for behavioral health interventions in disaster-affected communities. With a dual master's in social work and public health from Tulane University and a PhD from the University of Texas, she explores the impact of behavioral health interventions in the U.S. and abroad. Drawing from her experience living and working with disaster-affected communities, Dr. Powell has actively collaborated with local areas and global humanitarian organizations to develop, research, and distribute behavioral health interventions for individuals, families, and communities affected by collective trauma. Her experience spans a range of contexts from communities impacted by conflicts like the Syrian crisis, to those who have experienced pandemics and climate-induced disasters such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and tornadoes. Dr. Powell's work has received funding from renowned organizations such as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Save the Children, USAID, the National Institute of Mental Health, and the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. We are extremely excited to have her with us today. Please put your hands together for Dr. Tara Powell.
Thank you all so much for being here, and I'm really excited to talk and give this keynote about something that's very near and dear to my heart. So today, what I'll really be focusing on is I'll be focusing on talking about how we can heal together. How do we map recovery after a trauma, and specifically I'll talk about my experiences with disasters, and then how do we rethink resilience? How do we become resilient? How can we support individual and community resilience after a collective trauma? So what I wanted to do was I wanted to start off and provide you all with a little background, my own background in disaster mental health and how I even got here. So my journey in this area really began in a time and place when many of you might remember, and that was Hurricane Katrina. So at that time, I was young, I was studying complex emergencies at Tulane University, trying to get my master's in social work and public health. I was very, very excited about this field, but as luck would have it, during my academic endeavors, the exact kind of disaster I was studying hit. So originally what I wanted to do was I wanted to go overseas and work in disaster response and recovery. But seeing Katrina hit, I was like, okay, this is exactly what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna help the city recover. And so when I returned to New Orleans to aid in the recovery efforts and to continue my master's, I really found a city that was profoundly changed. So with my own home damaged, I was unable to move back to my house due to a housing shortage. But luckily I was able to stay in my friend's sunroom until I could find something that was suitable. So I soon found myself wearing two hats: a service provider, working within schools, within FEMA trailer camps, within community agencies, and then also as a survivor. So I was maneuvering personal losses and stressors that a disaster such as Katrina can bring. So as a provider, I worked with many children who were still separated from their families. It was a reminder of the long road to recovery. A lot of the children that I worked with, they were heading the household, raising their siblings, while their parents were stuck in Houston, just trying to work and trying to get back. But working with these children, it was really interesting to see. While many had similar experiences, some were coping very well, and others were struggling with significant emotional distress, depression, anxiety symptoms, post-traumatic stress symptoms. There are two children that I thought about when I was thinking about today. So one of the children was stuck in New Orleans when the floods happened, when the levees broke. And she was in the top, she had to go to the top of a house in the attic and break out of that house with an axe and then go onto the roof when helicopters came to get her. Now, she actually was coping really well. It was weird, I didn't understand. I was like, you went through so much trauma, but you're really doing okay. Yeah, she needed support, but she actually was doing pretty okay adapting. And then there was another child that I worked with. He was a little bit younger. He did have the stress of evacuating, but he wasn't in the city when the city flooded. He didn't have to go into any of the shelters, but he was experiencing significant post-disaster or post-traumatic stress symptoms. So this made me wonder, why do some children adapt okay and why do some not? Sorry, my mouth gets dry. But I also saw the progression of a community, in addition to my work directly with children, I saw the progression of a community bonding together and to really support each other during the recovery. So this sense of unity and support was really a bright spot during a tough time. So one question, as I was working with the recovery, from people who were outside of the city, they said, when is Katrina over? This happened in 2007, 2008, 2009. Everybody said it happened in 2005. Like, can people just get over it? They're going to be fine. But even years after the hurricane, the city was still recovering, which really brought me to a deeper understanding that disaster recovery is pretty messy and it really takes a long time. So my Katrina experience was life-changing. Even though it was extremely challenging, it brought up so many questions that molded my work over the years. So, as I mentioned, one of my primary questions was, how do people adapt and recover from these events? And what do we need as individuals, families, and communities to recover? So today, what I will be talking a bit about is I'm just going to give you a background of a few different collective traumatic events. What are the common emotional toll of these events on the individual, family, and community? I then want to go a bit into the nature of and defining resiliency and post-traumatic growth and stress-related growth, because I think this is an important concept that we don't always focus on, or stress. And then I'll discuss a little bit about coping and the pathway forward. How do we move forward after we've experienced a significant trauma? Skipping ahead of myself there. So what do we know about disasters? So we know they can impact individuals, communities, and they can cause significant devastation and trauma. And we also know that communities are vital to recovery. And that recovery, as I mentioned, just like with Katrina, it takes time. Every disaster is different, and there are many different types of disasters. And the way it impacts an individual and a community are very unique, and unique to the individual and the community that it's affected. So I just want to get a show of hands. I want to gauge everybody a little bit here. So the first disaster that I'm going to talk about is an environmental disaster. So an environmental disaster is a catastrophic event that's caused by earth processes. So these are generally acute, they're generally sudden, they often cause extreme damage, and they can have short and long-term consequences. So with a show of hands, I wanted to see how many of you have directly experienced a disaster, an environmental disaster. Okay, so we've got some out there, and you can keep your hands up. So how many of you have indirectly experienced an environmental disaster? So this could be a tornado, flood, hurricane, anything like that. So just knowing somebody who's experienced one. Yeah, it's quite a few people. And then how many of you have watched the news and been affected by the impact of a disaster on others? So many of us. Yeah, so most of us at some point in our lives will experience or know somebody who has experienced, if you haven't already, an environmental disaster. What we know from frequency is the size and scope of these disasters are growing. The top up here, it's very small, is in 2000. But this is a good visual of us to see, and these are billion-dollar disasters. So from 2000 to 2022, well, in 22 they had half the year there, so. But until 2021, what you can see is a significant increase, a marked increase in these billion-dollar disasters throughout the US, and this is also throughout the world. The second type of disaster that I'm going to talk about today is a pandemic disaster. So I think this is pretty close to all of us. What we know is it has a global impact, it's prolonged, Transmission rates are very high, which can lead to different types of public health measures and public health restrictions. And there's also a strong impact on health systems, so it impacts our healthcare providers. It can overwhelm our health systems. And the response is very different. It's a protracted experience. It can take years to get back to normal. So how many of you were impacted by COVID? Anybody in here? Yeah. Yeah, so we all were impacted in some way, whether you had COVID or whether you had to do social distancing, or your work was closed, or you had some kind of disruption. It caused significant disruption throughout the entire world and on a global scale. So what is the short-term impact? So what do we know about disasters? We know the short-term impact can cause psychological distress, can cause sleep problems, increased substance use, somatic issues, so physical issues as well, grief, loss, and a loss of sense of safety and security. What is the long-term impact? So long-term impact, okay, now I'm gonna get another show of hands. How many of you experienced any kind of burnout over the course of the pandemic? Any kinds of feelings of burnout? Yeah, so that's over the long term. So if you're experiencing a lot of stress and a lot of change from a disaster, over the long term, we often experience high symptoms of burnout. Post-traumatic stress disorder is often very high, depression, anxiety, chronic grief. So similar to the short-term impact, but they're more prolonged and can last many, many years. So now I'm going to talk just about what is our emotional response disaster cycle. So this is a typical disaster cycle. So this is a natural disasters. So what you see on this side over here is you see there's the emotional highs and emotional lows. And then on the bottom, that's a timeline. So what you see is pre-disaster. We're about in the middle here. People are doing okay, and then the disaster hits, and there's the impact phase. And we get a little bit stressed out, there's a lot of uncertainty, but then what you see is there's the heroic stage. People want to go in, they want to help, they want to, save people. I know in Katrina what we saw is a lot of friends of mine would go out on boats and help save people from houses who were stuck. And so that was that heroic phase. And then there's the honeymoon phase. So people, you go back and you're like, we're going to build back better. Everything's going to be better, and we're going to work together, and it's going to be great, and this place is going to be better than it was before. So you see that doesn't last very long, because then reality sets in. What we know is when reality sets in, you have to deal with rebuilding your house. You have to deal with FEMA. You have to deal with insurance. You have to deal with a disruption of your city and where you live and life as you knew it. And so this disillusionment phase, after a one-time event, after a natural disaster, they say lasts about a year or so. And then you go into reconstruction. So you've adapted, you're getting a bit better. And then you see over on this other side is, well, we're a little bit higher than we were before. So you see it's a little bit higher, and that's actually resilience. Even though it's not a huge raise, it's us being able to do a little bit better during the recovery. So now I want to talk about the COVID cycle and what I've seen. So I've just been documenting this as I went along because I thought it was really interesting as, working in disasters for many years. I was like, well, this COVID cycle, this is a little bit different because it's lasting a really long time. So what are the emotional highs and lows? So what we see is, I actually put maybe us a little bit higher than we should have been pre-pandemic. But what you see is, you really see when there was the threat, we get a little bit nervous. But then, as the threat continued early 2020, people were going out and they were saying, you know what, we are gonna help the healthcare providers, we support the healthcare providers, let's go, let's all bond together. But then, as social distancing continued, there was a lot of uncertainty. Also, we had a lot of other issues going on with our community. political unrest. There were many natural disasters in 2020 and 2021. People started getting quarantine fatigue. And that was really a long disillusionment phase. So what you see at the bottom is I've got 2020 to 2023. So where are we now? Then the vaccine came. People were, feeling a bit better. There were ups and downs, and definitely a lot of threat and uncertainty continued to happen. And then the world began to open back up. And you see us, where we are today. We're doing a bit better, but we're still not recovered. There were so many things that happened during COVID that were not directly COVID related. Not saying everybody, a person got COVID, but there were many, many secondary stressors. So social isolation, that's one thing that can really impact our mental health. Job security issues, stress around resources. A lot of people had issues with childcare. Relationships were challenged. There's not that uncertainty and unknown. What's going to happen in 5 years? We don't know because we might still be in lockdown. Fear, community and national issues, and separation and loss of loved ones. How many of you have experienced any of these things over the course of the past 3 years? So almost everybody. Yeah, so one of these things, one of us experienced. And so often in disasters, we don't talk about the secondary stressors. We talk about the disaster. But in all disasters, there are so many secondary stressors that we experience. So what we do know, and I mentioned a few of these on our reactions here, there's this pendulum. So while there are a lot of negative reactions to disasters, such as burnout, depression, post-traumatic stress, there's also survivor's guilt. So survivor's guilt is actually something that I experienced during Katrina, because even though I had lost my house, I didn't experience as much loss as a lot of other people. So I'd always question myself, well, I shouldn't feel bad. I shouldn't feel stressed because, I didn't lose as much as everybody else, or many other people. But one thing I've recognized over the years, and when I've worked with survivors, is that, you know what? It's okay to feel stressed when you've experienced loss and trauma, even if it's not as bad as somebody else's. But on the flip side of that, there's resilience, stress-related growth, post-traumatic growth. So how do we grow and really do better after the disaster? How can we reflect on what we've learned and how we can move forward? Oh, there's an anxiety symptom that just came up there. So, what do we know about the impact of stress and trauma during a disaster? Or during any kind of traumatic event. So stress impacts us on so many ways. Anybody been stressed in here before? Yeah? Yeah, so we all get stressed. Stress is normal, and it's often heightened when we've experienced a lot of a trauma, loss, any kind of major disruption in life. So there are physical reactions. So physically, anybody's back ever hurt a little bit? You've got tension in your back. You get a headache. Anybody get a headache when they're stressed? A few people, yeah. And then there's emotional, so intense and unpredictable feelings. So when you're stressed, has anybody ever just had like a crazy outburst and you like yell at somebody and you're like, why did I do that? So that's a really common reaction to stress. And then there's cognitive, so that's thinking and decision making. So sometimes we forget things. Maybe we're mid-sentence and we're like, okay, what was I gonna say? Well, a lot of times that happens when we're stressed. Actually this morning, because I was driving from Champaign, one thing that I did, and it wasn't a bad stress, but I was running around the house, I was like, where's my phone? Where's my phone? I can't find it. And it was just like right where I put it before. And so has anybody ever done that with your phone or with your keys? Yeah, so yeah, it's, that's a really common reaction to stress. We just kind of forget a little bit. Then there's behavioral, so heightened substance use issues, different risky behaviors that are often taken. And then spiritual. So when we've experienced a trauma, spiritual meaning we have to question, what do I believe in? What do I stand for? What are those deeper values that I hold? And then social. So our social interactions are also often, pretty limited when we experience extreme stress or trauma. We might withdraw. We might say, oh, I don't want to interact with anybody. I just want to be alone. So, what does the data say? So, in the first 6 months following a disaster, 24% of survivors will develop clinically significant post-traumatic stress symptoms. So that's actually really pretty high. 28% will experience some form of depressive symptoms. 23% will develop significant anxiety symptoms. So when I'm talking about post-traumatic stress symptoms, I'm talking about symptoms of nightmares, of reoccurring, like worried that the event will reoccur, constantly being on edge, being hypersensitive to your surroundings, to lights and noises. But we do know these trajectories vary based on the type of disaster, the amount of exposure, and also the age of a person. And so, for example, earthquakes, which are very unpredictable, and pandemics, which are very unpredictable, are associated with higher rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms and anxiety. And really, it's just all of that unpredictability and uncertainty. So as humans, we like to have a little bit of control over our lives. And that is really why, if we don't feel like we have control, if we don't know what's going to happen, if there's a lot of uncertainty, it can cause significantly more stress. So in 2023, so I was thinking about it, so, the pandemic, the world has opened back up, we're trying to get back to normal, but what we recognize is that, as I mentioned before, we are still in recovery. There's still a lot of things that we have to do to take care of ourselves, to take care of others, to take care of our communities. So in 2023, what we've seen is the amount of adults reporting anxiety and depressive disorders, and this was back in February, was 32%. And this was on from a national survey. And that's really high. Usually it's about a quarter of that in non-stress times. So we know that these symptoms are still heightened across the board. So I don't want to focus too much on the negative. So I've talked a little bit about the negative. What do we know? I want to really focus on how can we learn and grow. But I do want to talk about why we experience the outcomes that we do when we've experienced a traumatic event. So in trauma work, there is the 3 E's of trauma. So there's the event, and the event alone does not dictate how you're going to react. Then there's the experience. So how did you experience the event? Were you scared? Did you feel a sense of loss of control? Did you lose a loved one? What was that experience? Did you feel extreme fear? And then based on the event, the combination of the event and the experience, then we have the effect. And that is how you will respond. And so also with the experience, we can look at risk and protective factors. So risk factors, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but risk factors put you at higher risk for longer term psychological distress symptoms. Protective factors, they protect against them. And there's been a lot of research that's been done in my work, and that's really what I focus on, is trying to build protective factors for individuals, families, communities who've experienced trauma. So how do we grow after a disaster? So there are 2 terms that I'm going to talk about today. One is stress-related growth, and the other one is resilience. So I think almost everybody has probably heard the term resilience. It's thrown around a lot. Anybody heard of resilience before? Yeah, it's thrown around all the time. Stress-related growth is another topic that I think is really important, and it is actually a key factor to resilience. So how do we reframe resilience? So the term resilience it's always thrown around. People say, we're just going to be resilient. That's what we're going to do. But one of the things we really need to do is look at those deeper nuances of resilience. So what does it mean to actually be resilient? So This is the textbook definition from the American Psychological Association. So what is resilience defined? It's the process or outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. There are a lot of words on there, but really what we've traditionally thought about is resilience is just your ability to bounce back. But in reframing it, it's really important to recognize that resilience is actually a very long process. You're not just born resilient. As humans, we are resilient because we have adapted. Humanity wouldn't exist if we weren't resilient. But it's not a trait that we have. You're not just born resilient. It's really a set of strategies that we can learn and we can practice. And it's also based on our relationships, our community, and really our broader environment. So all of those factors put together really dictates what resilience is. So how do we get to resilience? So becoming resilient isn't something that happens overnight. In order to be resilient, you have to experience really significant hardship. So I was talking with a friend last week and we were talking about resilience, and she's also a colleague as well. And she said, everybody uses this buzzword, becoming resilient, but nobody tells you you have to go through a lot of tough times, and metaphorically speaking, she said, you have to dig through mud to become resilient. And I was like, yeah, that's actually true. You have to experience a lot of hardships, and it takes a lot of time and resources and energy to be able to bounce back and do better. And oftentimes, there are a lot of hiccups. Sometimes you think you're doing really well, and then there's a hiccup and there's a setback. But that's okay, because that's normal. So really, what it is it's a journey. It involves behaviors and actions that anybody can learn and develop. So research, what we know about research, it has shown that resilience is ordinary. It's not extraordinary, but it's like building a muscle. So if you go running every day, or if you lift weights, your muscles are gonna build. And resilience is the same. It has to be intentional, it has to be practiced, and there are different ways that you can focus on building that resilience. So focusing on connection, wellness, healthy thinking, meaning making, then I'm gonna go a bit more deep into these, but those can really empower you to withstand and learn and overcome difficult life and traumatic experiences. So in life, we all go through trauma. Every human in the world, if you're living, will experience some form of trauma, which can really impact our ability to function and can impact our behavioral health and our mental health, and that's okay because that's normal. But there are these risk and protective factors that can help us overall do better or can put us at higher risk. And just knowing these and putting words to them can help you think a little bit more about, okay, how do I work on my ability to bounce back? How do I work on my ability to recover? So these are things you probably have all heard. There was so much talk on self-care during the pandemic, and so people heard so many different things. Okay, I'm gonna try to do this self-care. But protective factors often involve a number of different dimensions. But first, and these are more the individual, and I'm gonna go into community in a bit. But just embracing healthy thoughts. So what does this even mean? One of the things that I think is important for us to recognize is to understand and to tell ourselves, this is hard. What I'm going through is hard. And it's gonna take a lot of work. And that's actually a healthy thought. Saying, it's okay. I've been through a hard time and I'm struggling. And this is not weird, this is normal. Finding a purpose. How do you find a purpose? Well, this can just be done through self-reflection and asking yourself, what makes me most fulfilled? Peer and family relationships are critical, and having healthy peer and family relationships. So having a good community, having people you can go to and talk to and help you feel safe and supported. And then also keeping a positive outlook. Even though things might seem horrible, looking towards the future. And so, all of these are things that can really help us build the protective factors to reduce the likelihood of risk. We know problem solving, self-esteem, social connection, all of those things are those protective factors that we see are associated with lower depression symptoms, post-traumatic stress, all of those disorders that come up when people have experienced trauma. Okay, what do we know about risk factors? So what is associated with higher risk of adverse mental health outcomes? Ruminating. So ruminating is going over and over and over again. You're ruminating, coping, you're thinking about something over and over and over again, and it's a bad thing, and you're like, I can't stop thinking about it. I don't know if anybody's ever ruminated. Sometimes I ruminate. I call it ruminative coping with my partner. Sometimes he's like, Tara, are you ruminative coping or are you active coping? If you're active coping, that's good. If you're ruminating, not good. And so all of us do ruminate sometimes. Unhealthy relationships. So really thinking about who are the people who are good for me, who are the people who maybe aren't so good for me in my life. Having an unhealthy or toxic relationship can put you at much higher risk for all sorts of adverse psychological distress. Not taking care of yourself. Sometimes it's easy to do kind of that avoidant coping. So avoidant coping is like, okay, I'm gonna not actively cope. I'm gonna take a step back. Consuming too much alcohol. So, 1 glass of wine a night is fine. Having 2 bottles, maybe that's a little bit too much. So it's like, where do you find that balance? And then isolating yourself. Sometimes we want to isolate ourselves. Sometimes we are like, I don't want to interact with anybody, and that's okay. But really knowing that you have the support, some people are more introverts than others, but being totally isolated can really impact us, our well-being overall. Okay, now I want to go a little bit into stress-related growth. So stress-related growth is a term that I came across during COVID, and I think it's really important factor in us reframing and rethinking how do we deal with stress and trauma. So what stress-related growth is it's personal growth, and is experienced as a result of the challenging, difficult, traumatic event that a person experienced. And what happens often, and we don't always think about it on the day-to-day because we're going in the hamster wheel trying to go, but it's positive changes in social relationships, personal resources, including life philosophy and coping skills that a person can experience after a trauma. So when we're thinking about stress-related growth, what we think about is it's really reflection. What did you learn? What did you grow from? Rather than thinking about the negative. So, for example, I rethought how I wanted to live my life. So I know during COVID, a lot of people rethought how they want to live their life. Did any of you rethink how you want to live your life? We got a few people rethink, what do I want to do? What am I doing? A lot of people quit their jobs, changed jobs, moved. I moved across the country. I was like, I want to live somewhere where there's mountains. So now I split my time between Champaign and Denver. And I was like, okay, well, I guess that's stress-related growth. Which I was like, okay, I'll do that. But another example is I learned I was stronger than I thought I was. So recognizing that, yeah, you've been through a hard time, but actually getting through that hard time and reframing and saying, oh yeah, I'm actually really strong. It's a form of how we grow. So thinking about how did I actually grow versus thinking about, oh, that was really hard. And a lot of times we don't have all that much time for reflection. But reflection can be really helpful in looking at, in the past year, or in the past 2 years, in the past 5 years, how did I grow? How did I change as a person? So how does the journey continue? Well, the journey is both on an individual, it's also on a familial, but also community level. So as an individual, we cannot just be resilient without the support of a community. So some key things to do, first is normalizing the stress, recognizing when you're stressed. You're like, oh, did I forget my keys somewhere? Or, oh, do I have tension in my back? You're like, okay, actually, yeah, I must be stressed. Oh, yeah, that's a normal feeling. Second is just regaining some kind of sense of control. Trying to, even if you can't have sense of control over your whole life, just taking little steps to having some kind of sense of control. That's social support, self-compassion. So self-compassion, I love the term, and there's been a lot of work on this, and there's different forms of self-compassion. But how many of you say things to yourself and judge yourself harsher than you would ever do to anybody else? You say things that you're like, wait, I would never tell somebody else that. Because that happens pretty often. We judge ourselves harsher. We have higher expectations for ourselves. Healthy coping, and then accepting change and being adaptable. And then our community-wide, having shared experiences. So in much of my work, I do mostly group work with my clinical work in disasters. And bringing people together is so powerful because people realize, they're like, oh, I didn't know another person was experiencing this as well. And so having those shared experiences and recognizing you're not alone is a powerful way for a community to support in recovery. Learning from each other, learning what resources are out there, supporting each other and having compassion for those who've experienced significant stress and trauma. So I only have a couple more slides, and then I'm going to open up for some questions. So mapping our journey. So this is more on the individual level. So as I mentioned, there's all those different dimensions of how we experience stress. Well, there's also all of these different dimensions on how we can experience well-being. So when I think about mapping my own well-being, I did this activity many years ago, and I always used it because it was looking at the different dimensions of what am I doing now and what can I do? What can I do to make myself overall do a little bit better, adapt a little bit better, feel a little bit better? So there's the physical. So what physically can you do to make yourself feel better, to enhance your well-being? It doesn't have to be, and it's very unique. So, you know, for one person, it may be running 10 miles. But if somebody told you, they're like, and you're like, oh, I don't know, I need to be doing better physically, and they're like, go run 10 miles. I don't know how many people would say, okay, maybe there's some runners in here, but but even just taking a walk, you know, physical, it doesn't have to be intense. Then there's the emotional. So what emotionally things you can do to help yourself feel a little bit better? This could be journaling. You can have deep breathing exercises, just doing some things to reflect on how can I support myself emotionally. Even talking to somebody else, but that overlaps with the social. Environmental. So our environment has a huge impact on our well-being. So how can you make your physical environment better? Whether this is at home or work, what can you do to make your physical environment a little bit more inviting to come into? And then spiritual. Finding your purpose is a big part of spirituality. Spirituality is much deeper than, you know, when we think about spirituality, sometimes we connect with religion. Well, religion is an aspect of that. Really what spirituality is exploring your own beliefs. What do you believe in? What are your core values? And then there's social. So, you know, just getting out there, finding the people that actually can support you, and you can be, you feel good about talking with after you talk with them, or you can tell them, hey, I've experienced all this stress, I need to talk to somebody. So community, what is community resilience? So what this involves, so it involves people. We need people that we can reach out to. We need to trust those in our community. We need to feel like we have a sense of belonging, safety, and caring. So communities can be defined in so many different ways. It can be the place you live, and say, you know, it could be Bloomington Normal, or, you know, elsewhere if you're coming from elsewhere. It can be within your work community. It can be within, say, an online community. It can be just your social supports and your friendship network. So we define communities in many different ways, and a community is what you make of it. A community is how you define, this is my community in this way. And so what we do know is people who are in a strong, tight-knit community, they have a sense of trust, they care for each other, and they want to support each other. So they have a collective sense of they can be part of this, they want to influence the environment and support the environments of all of the others within that network. So in community resilience, we also know that just having open communication with each other, identifying, a community is so important, and identifying resources. Today, you know, what I would say with the Behavioral Health Forum, you're part of a community. You're going to learn about all these different resources, and I looked, you know, through all the presentations, and they look really exciting and interesting. So, you know, just like identifying and mobilizing those resources, having that social cohesion, advocating for change, and reflecting and learning on what didn't go well, what can we change. So, what we know from experience in disasters, we know that recovery does not happen overnight. We know that it takes a very, very, very long time. Sometimes we just want to recover, and I know most of us just want to say, okay, COVID's over, we're good. But then we also have to think about all those secondary adversities and how are we continuing to recover from those. We know that time does heal. And as I mentioned, resilience is a journey. So rather than just saying, I'm going to be resilient, recognizing, hey, this is a muscle I got to exercise. And then, you know, social and community support is really critical. And we also know that community resilience matters. And then also, during a disaster, after a trauma, we have to be flexible and adaptable. We have to recognize, and change is hard oftentimes, but we have to be able to adapt because that's what makes us bounce back. But then also, oftentimes people need additional mental health supports. And I saw there was a few presentations on stigma today. You know, really reducing that stigma and helping people who maybe feel alone or feeling like they don't need a mental health support, going out and reaching out to somebody and getting that support that they need. And then also, when we're in recovery, we always make mistakes. Every person makes a mistake. Communities make mistakes. So learning from your mistakes and saying, okay, how did I learn from that? And how did I grow? And what would I do different next time? And so I think I'm just about done. So I'm just going to have one more slide. But just again, the pathway to recovery, that stay connected, acknowledging, normalizing how you feel, being patient with yourself and with others, reframing some of your thinking. Sometimes we're prone to thinking more negatively, so trying to think a bit more positively, having our own self-compassion, and, you know, having self-compassion, seeing those automatic thoughts, like, oh, am I judging myself too hard? Okay, wait, no, I gotta have compassion, I've gotta normalize, I have to feel okay, I have to say things are okay, or I have to say, yeah, well, you don't always want to say things are okay, but you can say, yeah, I'm experiencing stress, and I have to be compassionate towards myself for how I'm reacting. So just in closing, and then I'm going to open it up. So just in the face of adversity, we can really work together to find strength. We have the power to turn obstacles into stepping stones really towards a better tomorrow. And that was just a nice little quote that I found. And then I also have a bunch of mental health resources that I'm sure you have a million resources that you'll get today, but it's on the end of the slides that I would like to share. So thank you all, and I would love to open it up for questions.
right, thank you, Dr. Powell. We're going to open it up for questions here. I do have 2 mics. If you feel like you can project, go ahead and do so. I know it's early in the morning as well, so if you have questions later on today for Dr. Powell, please just come up and ask her. She'll be here throughout the day, or talk to one of us and we can relate those questions to her. All right, I see Ms. Sonia Reese way in the back there.
Would you comment on the stresses that we likely are experiencing with everything that's going on in the Middle East?
Can you comment on the stresses they're likely experiencing with everything going on in the Middle East?
You gotta get to the mic.
Yeah, so the stressors we're feeling here about that. Yeah, so there are a few different ways that we can think about that. So we are hearing on the news all the time about what's going on in the Middle East, and it's devastating. And we don't personally have a lot of control over it. So one thing that we do know when we're hearing all of this, devastation, death, destruction, conflict, when we hear that on the news, and when we're learning about it, we do want to keep up to date on all of that. But that can also cause secondary traumatic stress, and that's not something I really talked about as much as I should have. Secondary traumatic stress is extremely common. What it can do is that can cause us to have these secondary traumatic stress symptoms actually mirror post-traumatic stress symptoms. They can cause hyperarousal, so being more alert. They can cause sleeplessness. They can cause all of those same symptoms of PTSD. So when we hear of things, say for example what's going on in the Middle East right now, it's likely that we potentially can experience some of those secondary traumatic stress symptoms. One thing that we always say within disasters is, while we want to keep up to date on things, and it's important to and listen to the news, limiting that exposure can reduce the likelihood of longer term distress or of these symptoms. So turning on the news is good. Having CNN on, or CNN or whatever news source, it's just the one that came to my mind, on all day in the background actually can cause us significant distress. And so the problem with the Middle East that we're experiencing right now is we don't have a lot of control over it. So what do we do? And that's hard because we can't find a solution, and that's the unknown, and we have the empathy for what people are experiencing. But even just recognizing, how do I keep up to date? How do I limit my exposure to the news? Say if you want to, say an agency is going and supporting, finding a good agency that you could potentially donate to. Those are just some things that you can do as proactive strategies. So those are just a few examples, but I'm glad you brought that up because I think we don't talk about secondary trauma as much, and how prevalent it is when we are hearing about so many challenges throughout the world, and sometimes it gets played over and over and over again.
I think we had another question over here in the middle. Yeah, we have another microphone up here if you'd like to use it. It can be passed down.
Hi, Dr. Powell. Thanks for the presentation. I also got my MSW at Tulane, so.
Oh, great.
Green wave. I liked at the beginning how you introduced the 2 children and the variants in their reaction to Hurricane Katrina. As a behavioral health professional, I think sometimes we fall victim to projecting onto our clients, right, the reaction to trauma and traumatic response. So I'm kind of curious how, your suggestions for mitigating that.
So, wait, say it again, the suggestions for mitigating.
So projecting onto clients the reaction of a traumatic event. So, using your example in the beginning, the one girl that really experienced significant, in the moment having to escape from the impact of the storm, but she was okay. She was high on that resilience scale. But I think a lot of times, right, we kind of internalize how somebody should react and project onto them our own personal feelings. Does that make sense?
So I'm so glad you asked that as well. That is something that I really experienced a lot when I was in New Orleans working within the schools. As a therapist, and lots of clinicians came into the city who were working there, like, every child's got post-traumatic stress disorder. Every child's experienced all this trauma. Everybody needs treatment. And so what I looked at it, I was like, well, wait, most of the children I'm working with, maybe they're having some behavioral health and adjustment issues, but they don't have these clinically significant challenges. But they do need resources. So let's reframe this. And another thing, one thing that really came up when we were working with kids is everybody came in with all these different programs, and they're like, this is a great program, this is an evidence-based program, this is what we're gonna do, and they're gonna have the children talk about their trauma story. And so many children said to us, they said, oh, do I have to talk about Katrina again? I'm so bored. So one thing that I think as clinicians that we have to do is really recognize children will, they'll react so differently, and they will let you know, what they're experiencing. So we have to take a step back, and we have to say, okay, we're not going to assume this child has post-traumatic stress disorder. So one of the programs that I co-developed was a program really to address just the general behavioral health needs of kids after Katrina. And this was the reason that we co-developed is because it's really just focusing on kids building social support, identifying, recognizing their emotions, and there is no talk about the disaster. And oftentimes, what we find within there is what will come up is the symptoms the kids are experiencing without, it comes up organically and is child-led. And so that comes up, so we don't, as clinicians, have to say, these children have experienced this, therefore they will have these symptoms. Does that make sense? Answer the question. It's a hard one to remove yourself, because you're like, how did they experience such significant trauma and they're doing okay? But it's perplexing, and we know we can look at the data, and there's all sorts of different data on this child has the perfect formula for experiencing PTSD, and then they don't. So we do know it's very individualized.
So my question is, a lot of people are still kind of unwilling, I feel like, to go to therapy, and in widespread events, it's kind of difficult to get those resources for that many people. How do you think that we as a community could work on educating our community members that may not be willing to find that help? Do you think that education would be important as well? Just about why they're feeling that way and things like that.
Yeah, so you're talking stigma, huh? Stigma around.
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit of stigma, a little bit of access, right? Yeah, this is definitely a challenge because one thing that we need to reframe in terms of mental health is oftentimes people say, oh, well, I don't want to go to a therapist because that means there's something wrong with me. And as a community, what is really important for us to do is to recognize, okay, well, maybe we don't frame it in terms of oh, there's something wrong with you, you need to go to a therapist, but, oh, okay, well, you're having a normal reaction. Having somebody to talk to could be very helpful. The access is a bigger issue. But then oftentimes people don't go because they don't know where to go. They don't know where the resources are. So even just having those resources available, and I think that's what will come out of today is finding some of those resources. Lack of access, things we can do within our communities if there is significant lack of access in mental health care. We can do programs, and we can do community groups, community support groups, and those don't have to be, therapy, but they can really, maybe there's a person who is kind of teetering and really needs a lot of help, but, they may not be to the level that they want to seek individualized care. So having a trained clinician or a trained person in the background of mental health coming in and just running these groups, saying, hey, this isn't therapy, this is us supporting each other and learning from each other. So those are just some examples. It does take a lot of work, but I think reframing in terms of stigma, I think a big part of it is reframing how we think of mental health, and not saying, oh, there's something bad or wrong about you.
I have a question with regards to medical resources as well. So as much as there's mental health resources, somebody who just received the stellate ganglion block injections and dual sympathetic reset completely reset my trauma response. It's been incredible. And using psychedelics as well. I'm a combat veteran, and it's been a game changer. So I'm wondering, is there anything that you're looking at in the medical resources to also apply to what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, so I think, medical and pharmaceutical resources, I know there's been a lot of really interesting, thank you for the example on the psychedelics. There's been a lot of emerging and groundbreaking research on how these can really help reset our brains. So one thing we know is with PTSD, our brain gets a little haywire. The way the communication between our brain stem and our higher level cortical brain, it gets dysregulated, and then the communication gets disrupted. And what we know is certain types of, so what we're learning even more so about is certain types of psychedelics can really help rewire that. Also, there are different pharmaceuticals that can, and so I think, for certain people, as long as you go to get the appropriate care and go to somebody who has significant knowledge in the area, that these can be very beneficial as well. So what I've talked about is less about the medical resources, but those are critical also. So it's this combination of having both, I think, is in the communities, and getting that information out there of who can you go to, what are the doctors that are good. You don't want somebody just like throwing you something without actually fully knowing what you need. But yeah, no, that was a good question, and I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I can.
Just knowing if you've applied any of those in some of the disaster situations that you have seen.
Oh, personally?
Is there medical staff rolling in also along with the psychological and mental health staff to address that?
Yeah, so there are. So we generally work pretty closely with medical staff as well. I actually worked with an organization for many years. It's called AmeriCares, and they are a health-based organization. So while I was providing more of the tailored psychological support, we also had the doctors there with us. And so we would provide both services, and that, I think is a good way to provide a holistic care, set of care. But also internationally, it has been a big movement to increase doctors and nurses' knowledge of how do they identify psychological distress, symptoms that may need medical care. How do they provide that kind of pharmaceutical care to them, and how do they follow up? And so that's through a program through the WHO, World Health Organization, called MHGAP. And so that often works closely and aligned with those who are also providing the mental health and psychological supports. But yeah.
With that question, we're going to go ahead and end in order to try and stay a little bit on track here today. I just want to put our hands together one more time for Dr. Powell. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
For those of you that still need to register, please head up to the check-in deck.